In the years following the end of World War II, the coastal defenses of Britain, once considered a vital safeguard against invasion, were left in a state of uncertainty. The very structures and fortifications that had been hastily constructed to ward off the threat of German occupation now stood largely abandoned, stripped of their original purpose, and subjected to the harsh realities of post-war economics. The war had concluded, and with it, the immediate fear of invasion receded. But the questions surrounding the future of these defensive installations loomed large, as Britain sought to rebuild its economy, reintegrate its people, and adjust to a new global reality. At the height of the war, Britain had been in a state of constant vigilance. The fear of a German invasion was very real, and the nation's coastal defenses were an integral part of the island's strategy. The series of anti-invasion measures had begun as early as 1940, after the fall of France, when Britain found itself standing alone against the Axis powers. From the construction of coastal fortifications to the laying of minefields and the creation of pillboxes, these defenses formed an extensive, multi-layered network designed to repel an invasion force. By the time Germany's defeat in 1945 was sealed, the war effort had dramatically reshaped Britain's landscape. The military infrastructure built to safeguard the nation, once crucial to its survival, was now seen as an unnecessary relic. The structures, which included thousands of pillboxes, gun emplacements, anti-tank walls, and coastal defense batteries, were suddenly surplus to requirements. The size and scope of the defenses, estimated to number over 20,000 pillboxes alone, made them a significant feature of the landscape, stretching from the southern coastlines of Kent to the western shores of Wales and beyond. Yet, as the nation's economy strained under the weight of post-war reconstruction, it became apparent that maintaining these coastal defenses was no longer feasible. Britain was in the midst of demobilizing its military and returning to peacetime priorities. The industrial war machine that had once churned out weapons and equipment at a staggering pace was now transitioning to peacetime production. Resources were needed elsewhere, on rebuilding cities, providing for the millions of veterans returning home, and addressing the shortages of housing and consumer goods. The question then became, what to do with the vast network of defensive works that crisscrossed the country's coastline. In 1945, it was clear that the threat of invasion had diminished. The German military, devastated by the Allied advances, no longer posed a realistic threat. The once urgent need for such a formidable coastal defense system was fading quickly. In addition, the arrival of new technologies, such as radar and air defense systems, meant that many of the older static defenses were becoming increasingly obsolete. The focus of military strategy was shifting towards a new era of warfare, one in which mobility and technology would play a far more prominent role than the static fortifications of the past. At the time, the British government was faced with difficult decisions regarding the future of these defenses. On one hand, dismantling or repurposing the structures seemed to be the logical course of action. Yet, doing so would incur significant costs, not only in terms of labor but also in the destruction of materials that could be recycled or reused elsewhere. On the other hand, there was the option of simply abandoning the defenses. Some local authorities took matters into their own hands, either through neglect or by gradually dismantling the defenses for scrap. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was a palpable sense of uncertainty surrounding the fate of these fortifications. Some were left to rot in the elements, their concrete and steel structures slowly succumbing to the ravages of time. Others were repurposed for civilian uses, serving as storage spaces, or in some cases, being converted into makeshift homes for people displaced by the war. However, the process of repurposing or scrapping these defenses was slow and haphazard, as the nation struggled to deal with the overwhelming demands of post-war recovery. By the late 1940s, a growing sense of pragmatism began to take hold. Local authorities and the Ministry of Defense began issuing more formal guidelines regarding the removal of obsolete defenses. In 1948, a Ministry of Defense directive recommended the removal of many of the coastal pillboxes and other fortifications, particularly those that were considered unnecessary or redundant. Yet, for all the official guidance, the pace of deconstruction was sluggish. Many of the defenses were left in place, abandoned and forgotten, standing as silent monuments to a time of fear and uncertainty. Despite the clear push to dismantle or repurpose these structures, some elements of Britain's coastal defenses continued to be used for military purposes. In some cases, batteries and observation posts were retained as part of the country's broader defense strategy, particularly in areas where tensions with the Soviet Union were high. These installations remained in a state of minimal activity, serving as symbols of Britain's ongoing commitment to its national security. Yet, even these remnants of the coastal defense system were often neglected, with personnel numbers dwindling and equipment slowly decaying. The cost of maintaining and dismantling these coastal fortifications was significant. The post-war British economy was in a fragile state, burdened by the war's enormous financial toll. The government's priority was clear: reconstruction. Resources were limited, and much of the funding that might have been used to maintain or repurpose the fortifications was instead diverted to the rebuilding of cities, the improvement of infrastructure, and the creation of the National Health Service. The focus was on addressing the immediate needs of a society struggling to recover from the devastation of war. In the absence of sufficient funding, many coastal defenses were simply abandoned, left to deteriorate. The decision to leave them largely intact was also influenced by logistical challenges. The removal of so many installations was a complicated process, requiring both time and resources that were simply unavailable in the immediate post-war years. In many cases, there was also a lack of clarity about who was responsible for the maintenance or demolition of these structures, adding to the inertia that characterized much of the early post-war period. As the 1950s progressed, the situation remained largely unchanged. The coastal fortifications continued to dot the landscape, slowly fading from public consciousness. For those who remembered the war years, they were a symbol of Britain's wartime resilience. For others, they were increasingly viewed as anachronisms, relics of a bygone era. The decision to keep or dismantle them was left to the discretion of local authorities, and in many cases, little was done. As the decades wore on, the process of scrapping or repurposing Britain's coastal defenses gained some momentum, but it was not until the 1960s and 1970s that serious efforts were made to clear the remaining structures. Some were sold for scrap, while others were simply abandoned. The majority, however, gradually fell into ruin, slowly being overtaken by nature and time. Many pillboxes and gun emplacements were left to be consumed by the elements, eventually collapsing into the earth or being swallowed up by coastal erosion. The once formidable network of coastal defenses, which had been built at such great cost and effort, was being dismantled piece by piece. But even in their decay, they remained as a testament to the anxiety and urgency of wartime Britain, a stark reminder of the years when invasion was a constant fear. The final fate of these coastal defenses was not a sudden or dramatic one. Rather, it unfolded over decades. Some structures were saved for posterity and designated as historical monuments, while others were simply forgotten and lost to time. By the 1980s, most of the once thriving network of defenses had disappeared from view, leaving only scattered remnants behind. The once familiar sight of pillboxes, bunkers, and gun emplacements had faded from the landscape, and the fear of invasion that had driven their construction was now a distant memory. The story of Britain's coastal defenses after the war is one of neglect, pragmatism, and gradual erosion, both of the physical structures and the memories of the wartime anxieties that had once given them purpose. What was once a vital and imposing network of fortifications became, over time, a casualty of post-war priorities. It was a reminder of a moment in history when the fear of invasion had been very real, but also of how quickly the tides of time can render even the most formidable defenses obsolete. As the 1950s progressed and the immediate concerns of post-war recovery began to ease, the fate of Britain's coastal defenses was further sealed by the shifting tides of national priorities. The once urgent need for these fortifications, constructed to defend against invasion, had diminished to the point where the question was no longer if they would be dismantled, but when. As the Cold War began to reshape global geopolitics, Britain's defense strategy evolved, focusing increasingly on nuclear deterrence, air superiority, and the potential threats posed by the Soviet Union. The obsolete coastal defense network, once seen as essential, now seemed like a forgotten relic of a different time. By the mid-1950s, Britain had undergone a significant transformation. The economic strain of the war, along with the pressures of reconstruction, meant that the country was no longer in a position to maintain large-scale military infrastructure that had no clear purpose in the post-war context. The priority for the government had shifted from defense preparedness against a conventional invasion to securing the nation against more modern threats. In this new landscape, the remnants of the coastal defense system were increasingly viewed as unnecessary and burdensome. The economic realities of maintaining a large number of coastal fortifications were daunting, particularly in an era when the country was grappling with the costs of rebuilding, modernizing, and restoring basic services to its population. In the years following the war, the British Ministry of Defence, faced with limited resources, began to take steps to clear away the obsolete infrastructure. A significant number of the pillboxes and gun emplacements that dotted Britain's coasts were dismantled or destroyed, though the process was neither swift nor comprehensive. The removal of these defenses was not a priority for the government in the immediate post-war years, and as a result, many structures remained standing, abandoned, and deteriorating. The burden of dealing with them largely fell to local authorities, whose priorities were often elsewhere. The cost of scrapping or repurposing the coastal defenses was significant. In addition to the labor required to dismantle and dispose of the concrete and steel structures, the removal process was logistically complicated. Some defenses were located in remote or difficult-to-access areas, making their removal costly and time-consuming. For many local governments, the task of removing these fortifications was simply too great a burden, especially as they faced competing demands for resources in the post-war era. Thus, the question of what to do with the remaining coastal defenses was left largely unresolved. While many of the fortifications were removed, others were left to languish, either slowly crumbling or being repurposed for civilian uses. Some of the pillboxes were turned into storage spaces, while others were used by farmers or private landowners as makeshift shelters or animal pens. In some cases, the structures were simply left abandoned, with no official plan for their future. It was clear that the vast network of coastal defenses was not going to be cleared in the near future, and for many Britons, the memory of their wartime purpose faded as new generations grew up with no direct experience of the invasion threat. In the late 1940s and 1950s, a number of the coastal defenses were used by the military for training purposes. The concrete bunkers and pillboxes provided useful sites for soldiers to practice in urban and coastal warfare scenarios. This occasional repurposing for military training served to preserve the structures in certain locations, but it also highlighted the growing irrelevance of these defensive measures. The threat of invasion was no longer imminent, and the military's focus had shifted to a more modern and mobile form of defense. In time, as the Cold War intensified and the specter of nuclear warfare emerged, Britain's military strategy increasingly focused on deterrence and the use of advanced technology. By the 1960s, the Ministry of Defense began to formalize efforts to clear the remaining coastal defenses. In some cases, the fortifications were sold off for scrap, a decision that was partly driven by the rising demand for raw materials and the need to generate income for the government. The process of scrapping the coastal defenses was often piecemeal and inefficient, with some materials being recycled and others left to decay in situ. Many of the pillboxes, observation towers, and gun emplacements were sold to private buyers, who stripped them of any usable materials before abandoning them. Others were simply left to deteriorate in the harsh coastal environment, their concrete facades weathered by saltwater and wind. During the 1960s and 1970s, the remnants of Britain's coastal defenses continued to disappear from the landscape. The gradual process of destruction, repurposing, and decay left only fragmented memories of the once vast network of fortifications. Many of the pillboxes were swallowed by nature, overtaken by vegetation, or buried by sand and soil. Others were lost to erosion as the coastal landscape shifted over time. In some areas, the remains of the fortifications became virtually invisible, eroded beyond recognition by the relentless forces of nature. Yet, despite the steady erosion of the coastal defenses, some of the more well-preserved structures were recognized for their historical value. In the 1970s and 1980s, There was a growing interest in preserving the remnants of Britain's wartime infrastructure as part of the national heritage. This movement was in part driven by a desire to remember the sacrifices made during the war and to honor the resilience of those who had built and defended these structures. Preservationists and local history groups began to catalog and protect certain coastal fortifications, ensuring that they would not be forgotten. A number of pillboxes, gun emplacements, and coastal batteries were saved and designated as historical monuments. These structures became part of the broader effort to preserve Britain's wartime legacy, and many were open to the public as historical sites. Some were integrated into local museums, while others were preserved as part of educational projects that sought to teach future generations about the country's wartime history. However, the preservation efforts were not universal. Many of the coastal defenses, particularly those in remote or less accessible areas, were left to decay completely. Even the preserved structures were often in a state of disrepair, with the passage of time and exposure to the elements taking their toll. The surviving pillboxes and bunkers stood as silent reminders of a bygone era, their concrete shells battered and eroded by time and the weather. The final remnants of Britain's coastal defenses slowly faded from public consciousness. By the 1990s and 2000s, most of the fortifications had either disappeared or become largely invisible. The once proud network of coastal defenses had given way to modern developments, the coastal landscape having been reshaped by housing projects, roads, and other infrastructure. The fortifications that once played such a significant role in the defense of Britain during World War II were now relegated to the margins of history.